So welcome everybody. Welcome back to many people for our third part of our Scholar in Residence weekend. But I said this a little bit this morning during Bagels and Torah, but I want to say it again. And I said it a little bit last night, how this whole project came to be. Last spring, I was thinking about what shall we do for adult ed this year at Temple B'nai Or, and I've been getting the emails from Sinai and Synapses for a long time. You're going to learn about them in a second. And I said, well, why don't we apply? Sinai and Synapses is an organization that brings science education into synagogues, especially their Scientists in Synagogues program. So I said, maybe we should apply for this grant. So I asked two trusted congregants that we have who are scientists, Susan Levinson and Mark Marin. Where's Mark? Matt, sorry, Matt Marin. Yeah, it's very amusing. And so I brought Susan and Matt here, and I'm like, what do you think? Will people be interested in learning about science and Judaism? And they said, yeah, probably. So we applied for the grant. We brought Dr. Eric Dreff on board with his philosophical knowledge. Eric has a PhD in medieval Jewish philosophy, and he really helped us organize. He's really been the one to organize this whole program since the fall, where Dr. Leslie Phelps has, we learned about psychology and how we changed leading into the High Holy Days, and then we studied the question of what does it mean to be a human, where we looked at the Bible, we looked at the rabbis, we looked at biology with our two doctors here, we then talked about the future that is now through AI with Jason Albert, who taught us about AI, how AI works, but also the ethical questions that it will bring up. And it's been wonderful conversations the whole time, all of these months, culminating tonight in our scholar who we'll introduce in a second. But thank you to all of the people here who have brought us to this point. Thank you for financial support, especially from Susan and Susan and Bob and where's Ken and Suzanne and I will say, because you love great adult ed here at Temple B'nai Or, we always need support and we always need ideas, but also we need support. So we are here for donations, of course. But thank you for all of that support. And so to learn more about this wonderful organization, Sinai and Synapses, it's my honor to welcome Rabbi Jeff Middleman, who we spent 4 years together in Cincinnati studying to be rabbis. So it's great to be able to see him again. He's come in tonight from Westchester. So Rabbi Middleman.
Thank you, Rabbi Satz. It's wonderful to be able to be with you. I remember watching, I'm a big Yankees fan. We watched some of the Yankees Marlins World Series back in 2003. Yeah, so he piggybacked, and we were able to hear. But it's wonderful to be able to be with you all. What a wonderful program. As Rabbi Satz said, this is a project that we've run called Scientists in Synagogues through an organization I started about 10 years ago called Sinai and Synapses. And this was not just something that was, oh, this is a wonderful piece. You all put together an incredible application. This was a competitive application process. And the application that Temple B'nai Or put together was so strong, it was one of the ones that we very, very quickly said, yes, this is one that we're going to be able to accept here. So you should feel very pleased with how terrific this community is and how great some of the questions are that you're thinking about. Sinai and Synapses explores the intersection of religion and science. One of the things that we really focus on is a lot of the language that you use is the biggest questions that we face in this world are not just religious and they're not scientific, not just scientific, they're really human. Who are we? How do we act in this world? And how do we have a better, more constructive conversation? And we love looking at it from so many different perspectives, from different scholars. I'm excited to be able to hear from Professor Ravven in a few moments. And this is one of a synagogue. We have had close to 50 synagogues from all over North America that have been doing programs on scientists in synagogues. It's predominantly funded, by the way, by the John Templeton Foundation, which you may have heard of. And actually, this weekend, we have 3 different synagogues doing programs. In Boston right now, Professor Howard Smith, who is an astrophysicist at Harvard, is speaking at Temple Israel of Boston. In Congregation Bethel Ner Tamid in Philadelphia is talking about cardiology. There are synagogues in Pasadena. We have the former president of Caltech as one of the synagogues there. So this is an incredible group of communities and synagogues that you all are a part of. Once a week, we put something out. We put out predominantly content. We're going to be including some of the work from Professor Ravven here, but from all of our different scientists, synagogues, communities here. If it's okay, we're going to add you to our weekly email list. You can always unsubscribe. Our feelings are not hurt, but we think that you would really enjoy hearing and reading about all the different content. This is, we try to be able to look at everything from medical technology to questions of privacy, to questions of artificial intelligence, to questions of psychology. And also we have some work in the interfaith space, and also just interesting articles that you may not have seen on Big Think and Ion and different articles to be able to look at. So if you start to get that next week, that'll be from us, and we hope that you continue to enjoy and learn and continue to grow, and may Temple B'nai Or continue to go from strength to strength in this wonderful community of learning. And I am very excited to be learning here this evening. So thank you so much for bringing me here this evening, and for you all bringing this great project to your own community.
So Professor Heidi Ravven from Hamilton College in New York has been our scholar this Shabbat. And when Eric, Dr. Eric Dreff and I were first talking about how can we bring a scholar here to Temple B'nai Or, what scholars should we bring, because we were batting around a lot of ideas, and we came to the idea of the question of what is a human. And right away he said, well, I know of this scholar of Baruch Spinoza, the early modern Jewish heretic, heretical maybe, thinker, who really writes about this. What does it mean to be a human today? The idea of free will, the idea of, is there an I? The idea of being embedded in a community, being embedded in a body, what all of these questions. He said, I know that scholar, and that scholar is Professor Heidi Ravven. And so we called her up, and she said, yes, I would love to teach at Temple B'nai Or. And so finally, here we are. After hearing her story last night during services, after text study this morning, digging into the Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed, and the story of his take of the story of the Garden of Eden, and what does that have to do with our scientific lives now and tonight. We're going to learn a lot about her research, and right from your book.
Yes, partly from the book.
Partly from the book, the Self Beyond Itself, which I finished the other day, and everybody needs to read. It will make you rethink what it means to be a human and what it means to be ethical. And so it's my honor, it's our honor, I think, to learn with you.
Thank you so much. That's so kind, and I'm humbled by so many things that you've said. Thank you also, Rabbi Jeff Middleman and Sinai and Synapses. Oh, I'm sorry, can you hear me now? And thank you, Eric. I'm sorry? I have a problem, and that is I'm really having trouble seeing in this spot. It's really kind of tough, the light, and I made it very small letters. Okay. Okay, I will do the best I can, and if we need to move in some way. I think I might be better up there, because I can't see well enough. I'm so sorry.
So just have to.
I prefer to be closer and with you all, but I think I need to see. I'm so sorry. Okay. Okay. It is a great honor to speak today about wisdom that the Jewish philosopher Spinoza brought to understanding the nature of the human and of possible human futures and how to get there. How to envision and work toward a future of well-being together for ourselves, for our children and grandchildren is, of course, all of our concern. And Spinoza may help us, especially because he anticipated and thought through the ethical implications of important scientific insights, especially in what we now call the neuroscience of the emotions, affective neuroscience. So this talk tonight is called Becoming at Home in the Universe, as well as in our skins, insights from Spinoza and the new brain sciences. Are we divided against ourselves, a mind in perpetual rebellion against a wayward body, and a body inherently desirous of those things that our mind tells us to resist? Is temptation the fate of the human? Can we envision a human future in which our internal bodily and mental spiritual nature is unified and our belonging to in the universe a fundamental goal, so that our well-being and that of what we usually refer to as the natural world, as if we were not part of it, and we are, reinforce each other in ecological balance and harmony? Don't we now know, given the threat and beginning real effects and experience of global climate change, that the very survival of a human future on this planet depends upon just such an embrace of nature, our inner nature, as well as planetary and universal nature? Yet are we then mere animals with little control over our fate within the massive forces of weather and geology, and even biology, psychology, and physiology? In the Psalms, this tension is described as lying between human inconsequentiality, a mere blip in time, our days but a passing shadow, within the vastness of nature, of the universe, and on the other hand, our special gifts. For at the same time as our infinitesimalness, the human person displays greatness and even glory. The psalmist speaks out to God, saying in Psalm 8, "When I behold your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars that you set in place, what is man that you have been mindful of him, mortal man that you have taken note of him? Yet you have made him little less than divine," or the angels, "and adorned him with glory and majesty. כי אראה שמך, מעשה אצבעותיך, ירח וכוכבים אשר כוננת. מה אנוש כי תזכרנו, ובן אדם תפקדנו. ותחסרהו מעט מאלוהים, כבוד והדר תעשרהו. How can we account for human potential and yet understand ourselves to be within the vastness of nature, of the universe, a scale of vastness now being discovered to be beyond anything imaginable to the psalmist, yet grasped by the biblical author, in principle nonetheless? How can we reconcile our full naturalness, our Darwinian origins, our origination and variation, diversification, and complexification, as Elizabeth Gross puts it, and our composition, like everything else in the universe, by stardust, how can we reconcile that with our capacity for self-awareness of just that? Astronomers' common observational wisdom is that there are 17 billion Earth-sized planets in our own galaxy, the Milky Way alone. The sun is about 1,400,000 kilometers wide. The Milky Way is 100,000 light years in diameter. That's 950 with 25 zeros after it, kilometers wide. According to the Hubble Space Telescope, there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, and we're not even in a big one. And each galaxy contains billions of stars, each with planets orbiting it. That's 1.4 times 10 to the 27th cubic meters in volume. Yet it's puny compared with some others. There are stars that are 2.9 billion times the size of our sun in volume. How do we come to understand ourselves, really become self-aware in terms of this vastness? That was Spinoza's project, although he did not understand the true vastness. How can we develop a self that sees ourselves in true proportion and in true context? Yet as far as we know right now, in our known world and experience, we human beings alone can do this. What's the advantage? Is there one? Are there many? Is the very act of recognition of our ephemeralness, beyond ephemeralness, in the vastness and eternity of time, space, and nature, we begin to see both our glory and our tragedy. Our self-awareness confronts us with the scale of our smallness and brevity, but the very possibility of knowing this, of being self-aware in this way, is beyond anything else we know of in the universe. For in the tiny dot in this corner of the universe that we inhabit, at this brief split second in universal time, we alone, as far as we know, are self-aware. At least that's our existential reality. We alone can grasp our position and our fate, individual and collective and terrestrial. We realize that it is in this interim and in this locale wherein we reside. And we can affect this little spot and moment our home for good and for bad, and we have. For example, 2023 shattered the record for the hottest year ever recorded since 1850 on Earth, according to NASA and NOAA. It was 1.8 centigrade or 2.12 Fahrenheit beyond the 20th century average of 3.9 degrees Celsius or 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Some scientists are now referring to the geologic epoch on Earth we are now in since mid-20th century, or some geologists say since the Industrial Revolution, as the Anthropocene epoch on the geologic timescale, because of the scale and range of change introduced into planet Earth by human activity. So we are confronted with the question of how to make the best use of it. How can our unique human awareness of the planet-wide reality of climate change and our unique human self-awareness of the effects of our own human activities upon the Earth, our planetary home, make a difference for ourselves, for our descendants, and for the Earth upon which our human survival depends. Enter Spinoza. Baruch Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632 and died in The Hague in 1677. His parents and ancestors had been crypto-Jews, Marranos, who had maintained their Jewish allegiance in the face of the forced conversions to Christianity that had swept the Iberian Peninsula, beginning in Spain in 1391. Finally reaching the remaining Jews of Portugal in 1497, where persecution had till then not been as intense. The Netherlands became a refuge for Portuguese Jews who had remained in the Iberian Peninsula and were still under the threat of the Catholic Inquisition when Holland achieved its independence from Spain in 1609 after a war of independence that had lasted nearly 100 years. Baruch Spinoza was thus of the first generation of former Marranos to be born in the Netherlands, a member of the Portuguese, that is, Jewish community. In the Netherlands, former crypto-Jews could renew their Jewish commitments openly and return to a Jewish communal life. Spinoza had a strong Jewish education and was educated in the Jewish philosophical tradition as passed down in the Sephardic world. He was particularly influenced by Maimonides, Gersonides, Crescus, and Hebraeolleone. The influence of Maimonides and Judeo-Arabic scientific naturalism, which we talked about this morning, is evident throughout Spinoza's works, especially in his assessment of the relation, even identity, of the knowledge of God and the love of God. A free thinker whose philosophic inquiry pushed him beyond customary bounds. Spinoza was excommunicated at age 24 from the still precariously established Jewish community of Amsterdam. He never joined another religious community, turning down the chair in philosophy at Heidelberg, a post requiring a religious test. Holland was widely known to be the most tolerant country in Europe and a haven not only for persecuted Jews, but for philosophers and other freethinkers escaping oppression in their own countries, like Hobbes and Descartes, who also spent time there for that reason. Spinoza took 5 years off from writing his major philosophic work, The Ethics, to write the theological political treatise in response to what he felt was an urgent demand of his time, the growing threat to liberty of conscience and thought, tolerance and freedom of worship in the Netherlands. In The Ethics, his major philosophic work and statement, Spinoza focused on the moral transformation of the individual. So I'll turn now to Spinoza and ethics. As the title of his major work suggests, ethics is at the heart of Spinoza's philosophical project. He first called it My Philosophy and then turned to call it his ethics later. What he first called, My Philosophy, later changed to The Ethics. So we see in this the centrality of ethics to Spinoza's overall philosophic project and thinking. Another indication of the centrality and perhaps pervasion of all philosophy by ethics in Spinoza's understanding emerges from the book in a different way. A book titled The Ethics actually begins with metaphysics about God and nature, and it ends with spiritual transformation, the human approach to God and love of God and an ecstatic closeness to God. So either everything is ethics in some Spinozistic sense, or ethics has come to be something else in the course of the book than what we thought it was at the beginning. Perhaps Spinoza was right, and it is we moderns or postmoderns who are wrong to compartmentalize ethics in one discrete domain among many, separating it from cosmology, metaphysics, theology, epistemology, biology, and psychology, and others, all of which contribute to ethics in his understanding. Spinoza makes clear that the assimilation of all philosophy to ethics, in some yet-to-be-determined sense, is not to be found in any simple moralizing of the universe. That is, in theorizing a universe created by a just anthropomorphic God where things turn out morally right in the end, the just rewarded and the unjust punished. For Spinoza famously embraced the phrase, God is nature. God or nature, by which he meant God is nature, an equivalence whose weight is on the second term, God or nature, is God is nature. To clarify, he ended part one of the Ethics with an extended attack on the error of attributing teleology, that's purpose or moral purpose, to nature. Nature doesn't have a moral purpose. Nature is not good, but it is perfect for Spinoza. He regarded the view that nature has inherent purposes and moral aims as intellectually suspect and mythic. Instead, he argued that nature follows strict and impersonal causal and logical sequences and is played out in natural laws that manifest the myriad interactions of forces. Its operation is the necessary deterministic working out of impersonal natural laws, like gravity, we would say, or the second law of thermodynamics, to give contemporary understandings. Laws that cannot be disobeyed because they are descriptive rather than regulatory. It is these impersonal causal principles and natural laws of science and metaphysics that Spinoza proposed express the divine. Spinoza regarded the image of a just lawgiver in the sky as an anthropomorphism that he rejected and derided as much as Maimonides did in The Guide of the Perplexed. Spinoza saw himself as a scientist of ethics. So my next section is Spinoza as scientist. Spinoza speculated about how ethics could emerge from biology and psychology rather than disrupt them, and recent evidence suggests he might have gotten it right. His radical deconstruction and reconstruction of ethics is supported by a number of avenues of research in the cognitive and neurosciences, and also in systems theory. Spinoza is famous for having been what philosophers call an ethical naturalist. He saw himself as putting the mind back into nature. Not only is the body natural, but the mind is natural. And he argued this against Descartes. In his Ethics, Spinoza offered what we would today call a moral psychology. His psychology was based on a view of the mind and body as one thing rather than two separable things barely holding together, as Descartes had claimed. Spinoza's wisdom is that to be rigorous and scientific and biologically rooted, looking at the human person without theological presuppositions, we need not make man into beast overlaid with a thin mental veneer. And on this naturalist basis, he rethought ethics. In the Theological Political Treatise, chapter 7, Spinoza surprisingly tells the reader that the scientific method of the discovery of nature and the method of the rigorous interpretation of literary texts, in particular of the Bible, of the biblical text, are by and large the same. He writes, quote, "I hold that the method of interpreting scripture is not different from the method of interpreting nature. For the method of interpreting nature consists essentially in composing a detailed study of nature as the source of our assured data, while in exactly the same way, the task of scriptural interpretation requires us to make a straightforward study of scripture as the source of our fixed data and principles," unquote. Spinoza further says of his biblical hermeneutic that it, quote, "demands no other light than the natural light of reason." The study of scripture, he held, as he, among a few others, invented the academic field of biblical studies, should proceed, quote, "by a process of logical deduction, by which that which is hidden is inferred and concluded from what is known," unquote. The scientific method applied to natural phenomena has this in common with the academic study of the Bible. Both take a detailed and disciplined look at the data, gather it together to discern patterns and propose classifications, and only then entertain possible explanations. For Spinoza, both are as empirically committed as theoretically rigorous and disciplined. And he further writes, quote, "We need a method and order similar to that which we employ in interpreting nature from the facts presented before us. Now, in examining natural phenomena, we first of all try to discover those features that are most universal and common to the whole of nature, to wit, motion and rest, and the rules and laws governing them, which nature always observes and through which she constantly acts. And then we advance gradually from these to other less universal features. In just the same way, we must first seek from the study of Scripture that which is most universal and forms the basis and foundation of all Scripture," unquote. The investigation of Scripture employs the same procedure as the investigation of nature, namely the discovery of what Spinoza calls the definition of its central features. Nevertheless, the method of interpreting Scripture and that of investigation in the natural world differ in one very crucial respect. For as in speaking of the Bible, Spinoza distinguishes between truth of fact and truth of meaning. Spinoza warns us that the biblical text as a written document, in contrast with the scientific exploration of nature, yields at best only truths of meaning and not truths of fact. Quote, "The point at issue is merely the meaning of texts, not their truth," he writes. "The aim in both natural science and the interpretation of texts is to discover by rigorous application of an empirical and theoretical method what is there. Categorizing the data and exposing the regularities and patterns and conjecturing about their etiology as well as their current state in the effort to understand, as well as our current state. But only in the case of science and not in the case of religious literature or any literature can we be assured by this method that we have achieved truths of fact. That is, that our method has yielded an account having anything to do with the way the world is and works. Science, but not literature, cuts nature at its joints, so to speak." Spinoza further proposes the principle that the knowledge of Scripture must be sought from Scripture alone, just as the knowledge of nature must be sought from nature alone, or from nature itself. Elsewhere in the Tractatus, especially in chapters 1 and 2, Spinoza characterizes religion and religious literature as imaginative, as Maimonides did, his mentor, rather than rational and philosophic or scientific. That is to say, it is the product of associative and symbolic and metaphorical thinking, an interpretation and explanation of the world that is often idiosyncratic and always culturally specific. So even though our method of studying this literature, our hermeneutic, may be as rigorous and rational as our inquiries into nature, what we can hope to find there and how it is conveyed differ markedly from what we find when we explore the natural world. Spinoza in this is breaking from his great 17th century philosophic mentor Maimonides, who held that the biblical text, if understood correctly, and according to the discovery of its hidden meanings and agenda, would offer the rudiments of basic physics and a naturalistic scientific worldview. We talked about that this morning. For Spinoza, however, in contrast with Maimonides, the Bible is literary and moral. It's not scientific. At the same time, however, Spinoza insists that the division between nature and nurture,
or convention must not be exaggerated. For causes are continuous and understanding layered, but open and strives towards coherence. The imaginative mind, which expresses itself in culture, symbol, social conventions, metaphors, idiosyncrasies of personality and time and place, is a feature of the natural world as much as is the rational mind, rather than radically separate from it. For the human mind is not, as it was for Descartes, a kingdom within a kingdom, as Spinoza castigates Descartes in the introduction to Part 3 of the Ethics. The distinction between nature and nurture Spinoza articulates in terms of proximate versus distant and ultimate causes, local versus wider and wider vantage points. Whoops. Okay. Spinoza never tires of reminding us that contra Descartes, his claim is that human beings, and particularly our mind and not just our bodies, are products of natural causes, external to us, but also those internal to our minds. So our thoughts are also natural for Spinoza and occur in regular patterns and in causal patterns. That we mentally internalize our worlds is a fact of nature and not just of nurture. Nevertheless, although amenable to rigorous inquiry and understanding, literature is not science, nor are its claims those of science. Pace Maimonides, as Spinoza insists. The Bible, he argues, is imaginative literature and philosophy, not philosophy or science, and hence it ought not to be seen as laying claim to scientific truth. At the same time, however, by the rigorous and systematic empirical study of it, Spinoza says, he has come to the conclusion that its narratives do convey imaginatively, which is to say in narrative form, some truths, namely practical ethical principles. That the ethics of the Bible is true, however, cannot be gleaned from the Bible itself, whose imaginative literary genre precludes validating such a claim. The claim must instead be evaluated independently, namely through philosophy and science. And that was a claim that Maimonides presaged and would agree with. Only science, natural philosophy, can yield insights into natural phenomena and regularities and causal explanations expressed in universal natural laws. Marjorie Green, in her introduction to the collection of essays she edited with Deborah Nails on Spinoza and the Sciences from 1986, says of Spinoza that he was doing science and understood himself as a practitioner of science. And this is what she writes. What traditional history of science has generally overlooked is that Spinoza was a practitioner of science, though not of experimental physics. He was a practitioner of scientific hermeneutics, and that was science. The fruit of the new method was to be a new science, not only of nature, but of human nature, not only of those hard, solid, impenetrable particles, but of ourselves. Once we rid ourselves in imagination of the distinction in kind between natural and human science, we can take seriously as contributions to the science of his time, Spinoza's research. So now we'll go on to a section called All Virtue is Intellectual. We need to ask ourselves, in such an impersonal natural universe of cause and effect, how does he derive ethics, an account of virtue? I mean, if his science is really descriptive, how do you get ethics out of this? How can knowing the laws of physics, for example, transform us morally and spiritually. The link turns out to be intellectual, for it is both the breadth of knowledge and the integrity and honesty of the search that demarcate the line between the ethical and the non-ethical. That is so Spinoza argues at length in the Ethics, insofar as we include self-knowledge in our scientific endeavor, extending from the self proper infinitely out into the universe and back. Perhaps Spinoza is the greatest practitioner and interpreter since Socrates of the Delphic maxim, know thyself, as the beginning of wisdom. For Spinoza's ethical theory, his account of virtue identifies all moral principles as specifications of, and all moral actions as flowing naturally therefrom, the integration of a searingly honest self-reflection with a push outward toward rigorous scientific investigation of all things in the universe. The highest good, that is virtue, Spinoza tells us at the beginning of his early unpublished treatise on the emendation of the intellect, his first aborted attempt at writing his philosophy, can be discovered only, quote, in the knowledge of the union that the mind has with the whole of nature. And there we get a little Kabbalistic move, although it's, his sources are not Kabbalah, but we can see a resonance. That is the goal and the project from which Spinoza never strayed. That attainment, quote, was as difficult as it was rare, and he believed he had accomplished it in the Ethics, a work he regarded as perhaps not the most beautiful philosophy, he said, but the true one. For Spinoza demonstrated in the Ethics that the scientific method of the tracing of causes and the discovery of causal principles, which he outlined in the theological political treatise in chapter 7, as the general method of rigorous scientific inquiry, which I just read you, and the integration of the resulting bodies of knowledge into an overall universal explanatory framework, as he attempted in the Ethics, could and ought to be applied to the understanding of oneself, and especially of one's own emotions, and the origin of one's emotions, the causes of one's emotions. What distinguished the search as ethical rather than narrowly scientific is the application of broad theoretical natural causal explanations to oneself, to one's mind, to one's thinking, to one's feelings, as well as to the body. That is the inclusion of the self within the universal framework of natural causes. Hence, it is where the explanation begins and exploration, begins and ends, not its content per se, that renders the scientific method a moral praxis, according to Spinoza. Its ethical power to transform self-deception and social deceptions and lies, and also just naivete and lack of knowledge, is in its capacity to engage and modify one's own self-understanding. Hence, for Spinoza, ethics is the path of knowledge of self in world and world in self, thereby transforming a person from immoral or non-moral or pre-moral to moral, from opaque to oneself to self-conscious and self-aware, a kind of knowledge that has profound implications for action. Spinoza harks back to an ancient Greek classical Greek moral sensibility of sin as a form of ignorance. He writes in part 4, proposition 23, quote, insofar as a man is determined to some action from the fact that he has inadequate ideas, he cannot be said without qualification to be acting from virtue. He can be said to do so only insofar as he is determined from the fact that he understands. Yet Spinoza is calling our attention not to an innocent ignorance, but what we today designate as motivated ignorance. He writes in Part 5, Proposition 42 Scholium, that, quote, "The ignorant man lives as if he were unconscious of himself, of God, and of things." It is a subterranean ignorance that disguises an unconscious or not fully conscious psychology of the uncritical acceptance of prevailing beliefs, even devolving at times into a denial justifying the dishonest embrace of self-serving illusions that skirt hard truths about both oneself and the world. It is here that desire comes into the picture. For ignorance of this kind is more an affective failure, a failure of desire, of motive, than it is a strictly cognitive failure. While ethics is a matter of understanding and self-understanding, it is desires, one's motives, pleasures, and emotions that drive thinking to be self-related. Thus, desire is the wellspring of virtue, for it is the source of the capacity for intellectual honesty, and also marks its failure. To illustrate the Spinozist principle, let's turn to the Holocaust as the source of poignant examples. Examples of decision-making in the Holocaust. And I'll begin with a quote from Philip Zimbardo, the social psychologist who devised the Stanford prison experiment that you probably know about. "Good people can be induced, seduced, initiated into behaving in evil ways that challenge our sense of the stability and consistency of individual personality, character, and morality. Thus, any deed that any human being has ever done, however horrible, is possible for any of us to do." Does the Holocaust have something to tell us generally about human decision-making, about how decisions are made by individual, by people in groups, when there is more than one group and within hierarchical organizations? Or are its lessons anomalous because of the extremity of the conditions in which they were played out? How powerful is the situation to influence decision-making versus how stable is character across all kinds of situations? And how powerful is the individual will in controlling a person's actions? Two particularly telling cases revealing how normal people made terrible decisions to engage in harm rather than saving action during the Holocaust come from an in-depth study by the psychoanalyst Robert J. Lifton of the Nazi doctors who oversaw and put into effect the program of systematic murder at Auschwitz, and from an equally sobering study by historian Christopher Browning of middle-aged Army reservists in the Hanover, Germany area who were called up to active duty in order to carry out mass roundups and murder of Jews behind the lines as the German army moved eastward. In both cases, people who before the war had been engaged in work appropriate to the normal activities and ends of their organizations and professions became murderers and mass murderers. Lifton and Browning investigated in detail how this could happen, showing that there was little or no coercion or retaliation that could be used to explain, let alone excuse, these perpetrators. Lifton shows that biological, ideological, linguistic formulas and their institutionalization were important in the transition from the historical violence of anti-Semitic pogroms, such as Kristallnacht, with which the Nazi murder of the Jews began in 1939, and the subsequent Nazi genocidal system that enlisted all the organizational structures of German society in the murder project, routinization and bureaucratization, the dividing up of the components of the sequence of murder into discrete parts, performed by different organizational sectors, also induced an emotional tenor of false calm, a false normality and legitimacy, and a false legitimacy and diffusion of responsibility. The characterization of the murderers as ordinary and of the carrying out of genocidal murder as normalized functioned as part of a vast lie. For via the lulling of the anticipated feelings that murder is assumed to express, they enacted the lie that what was going on was not really murder, but something else. Browning, too, found that psychological numbing was an important contributing factor in the organized roundup and mass shooting of Jews into mass graves by Reserve Police Battalion 101. One is almost incredulous when Robert J. Lifton quotes a Nazi doctor as saying, "I would remove a gangrenous appendix from a diseased body. The Jew is the gangrenous appendix in the body of mankind," unquote. Now that we see the linguistic sleight of hand, we wonder why anyone, especially doctors, who are educated people, would believe this rather absurd lie. More broadly, how do people come to hold beliefs, and under what circumstances do they adopt or refuse a belief? And who goes along and who refuses to go along? The evidence seems to suggest that it is the uncritical adoption of a particular and generally implicit or unconscious or not fully conscious interpretive framework for a given situation that is at the center of perpetration when it comes to normal people doing murder, like the Nazi doctors and the middle-aged army reservists. Acceptance of the implicit social meaning and rules of a situation involves the passive acceptance of authority in defining and redefining social and institutional reality through language and the enactment of it in playing a role. How do individual choices and personal decision-making come in then? The members of the SS, for example, have been classified into three categories. The first one is those who enjoyed and identified with the positions and roles, often extreme ideologues who gladly engaged in brutality. The second category is those who adjusted to their roles and did their jobs, often changing their views to fit their actions. And the third category, those who abhorred and were repulsed by what they were supposed to do and tried to lessen the burden on the victims, but nonetheless did it anyway, and did not protest. Philip Zimbardo, social psychologist I've been talking about, and Robert J. Lifton observed exactly the same threefold categorization in the student prison guards and in the Nazi doctors. Individual differences in decision-making seem to have played a role in the way that those in each particular category approach their assigned roles and then their type of identification with those roles. But in no case did these differences result in decisions to pose a challenge to either the authority or the legitimacy of the system or the persecution. This is how individual differences in decision-making weighed in. Normal people are potentially followers rather than architects of evil. The meanings of situations are largely social rather than independent, individual understandings and inventions. Cognitive framing of situations, social and cultural interpretations, group interpretations, and the authoritative voicing and transmission of those interpretations are the filters through which we encounter the world and upon which we base our decisions and choices. They were glaring in the Holocaust because of the extremity, so they became more visible to us than in normal circumstances, but not different in kind, only in degree. And really, the Tractatus Theologico Politicus of Spinoza is precisely about this, and how one must manage the social interpretation and the social rituals that convey those interpretations. Now for the good news. Rescue is also generally a collective affair, depending on situational interpretations and social belonging, as much as perpetration did. The Alliner's 10-year study of rescuers of Jews, in which they interviewed more than 700 rescuers and non-rescuers who lived in Poland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy during Nazi occupation, identifies the many groups and networks that were dedicated to aiding Jewish rescue. Nechama Tech found in her study of Polish rescuers that what they had in common was one form or another of an outsider identity, a less than full sense of belonging. Again, we think of Spinoza and what he did with the identity of a Marrano Jew as an outsider looking in and seeing what others could not see, and seeing it from an ethical perspective. Being on the periphery of a community, she writes, means being less affected by the existing social controls, unquote. This is one of the crucial sources of the moral courage that enabled bystanders to intervene with saving action. The rescuers interpreted the situation in ways that defied and countered the Nazi interpretation and that of its anti-Semitic sympathizers. Many had a form of outsider identity. Yirmiyahu Yovel calls Spinoza the Marrano of reason, the outsider perspective, and that gives the possibility of an honest look at the data and of the self. Being a perpetrator, a collaborator, or a rescuer depended largely on which group one was in or primarily identified with. For none of the rescuers was rescue a matter of thought-out, conscious choice. Most rescuers said that, quote, they had no choice, and that it was the ordinary thing to do. Rescue was the obvious action that resulted from viewing the situation in the way they did, and in the way that those like themselves with whom they identified and with whom they acted in concert did too. So some preliminary conclusions. In the case of both perpetration and rescue, what has come into focus as significant causal factors are social processes of group identity and the authoritative interpretation of situations, the relation to the larger society, group attitudes toward the legitimacy of the dominant authority, and the like, rather than expected differences in individual character or in the rational free choice of some individuals to decide to act according to moral principles or chosen virtues, and of others not to or to fail to. The amassed evidence of how normal people actually behaved in the morally crucial but also extreme situations of the Holocaust as perpetrators, bystanders, and surprisingly as rescuers, challenges the notion of independent individual decision-making. People acted as group and subgroup understood and interpreted the situations, and those beliefs were contextual and depended largely on social authority and norms. So I'm going to turn now to a little evidence from the new brain sciences. And this, as I come to the end. The new brain sciences can help us understand why interpretation is so variable, why it is so self-protective, and why it is so social, all truths that Spinoza anticipated and accounted for. I want to point to three important new ways of thinking about the brain that come together to inform both moral agency and the moral problem, how we come to be ethical, and what are the ways that our brains work that present obstacles to ethics. The first is the almost infinite possibilities of interpretation. That is due to the vastness of human neuroplasticity, the degree to which our brains are open to retraining throughout life as well as initially, even in such seemingly hardwired capacities as sight and hearing, for example, turns out to be far greater than we anticipated. There are 100 billion neurons in the human adult brain, and a neuron firing lasts about 1,000th of a second. Many fire at the same time. There are 30 billion neurons in the human cortex alone. This means that our brains have the capacity to make 1 million billion synaptic connections, and the possible neural circuits made up of these connections reaches a number impossible even to grasp, 10 followed by 1 million zeros. That's the source of the vast flexibility, the openness of human learning and thinking and behavior. Jaak Panksepp, the founder of affective neuroscience, characterizes the openness as, quote, undedicated computational space. He quickly points out that by this he does not mean that the brain is like a computer, but rather refers to openness to transformation. Our neuroplasticity gets pinned down and the brain not only filled in with content by experience and learning, but structured and restructured by them as well. Patterns and pathways of neurons firing together become more and more etched into our brains as we repeat them. There are periods of openness and then of pruning. The implications are paradoxical. The nearly ungraspable vastness of neuroplasticity alerts us to the openness of behavior. For all practical purposes, the openness of behavior and understanding and interpretation are infinite. And the interpretations and beliefs that drive our actions are also infinitely vast. Yet at the same time, our patterns of belief and action are stubbornly persistent. They are largely shaped by cognitive frames, as George Lakoff, the philosopher-linguist, has told us. Our minds are not receptacles of isolated pieces of information, but rather built of cognitive frames through which we organize and interpret and experience our world. These frames are largely unconscious as well as emotionally laden. We absorb them from the cultural, familial, institution, and historical environments in which we grow up. And that's what Spinoza is talking about in the TTP. Lakoff points out that language uses frames, prototypes, metaphors, narratives, images, and emotions in shaping our understanding or interpretation of ourselves and our context. The second feature of our brains that I call attention to is what I call tongue-in-cheek, our selfiness. Our selfiness or our self-interestedness is the urge to maintain, promote, protect, and further our embodied organic selves, not only the body, but also the mind and its contents. There is growing evidence that the emotions, which are self-promoting and self-protective, drive and inform our thinking and beliefs, for cognition and emotion are generally wired together. The overall tendency of our minds is to avoid what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, and this is what Spinoza outlines in enormous detail in part 3 of the Ethics, and he calls that interestedness the conatus, and he said it is the main definition of a person. The emotional shaping of our thinking makes our beliefs about ourselves prone to selfishness, manipulativeness, self-deception, hypocrisy, and self-justification. This is Spinoza's conatus, which is the desire of all organisms for self-protection and self-furthering, which he holds pervades both body and mind, that is, both physical and mental processes. He anticipated the vast openness of thinking and also how interpretation is always permeated with emotion and motivation as an operation and expression of a living being promoting itself and keeping itself alive. Despite all the ways that selfiness distorts and corrupts our beliefs and actions, we can nevertheless begin to discern the possibility of where a sense of moral concern and responsibility might come from. for our selfiness is mitigated by what I call our groupiness. Generally, we are selfie in a groupie kind of way. The self we further and protect is more often than not the group self. This is a third piece of the puzzle, and it is both good news and bad news for ethics. Spinoza anticipated this too, with his concept of the group mind. So the self beyond itself, the I that is we, and the we that is I. I'll begin with a quote from Alva Noailles, the philosopher. Where do you stop, and where does the west of the world begin? There is no reason to suppose that the critical boundary is found in our brains or our skin. And a second quote from the psychologist James Jerome Gibson. It's not what is inside the head that is important. It is what the head is inside of. The weight of neurobiological and other discoveries is pushing us toward the realization that the boundaries of the self can and generally do extend beyond the body. Taken together, the amassing evidence ought to begin to change where we look for the search for ethics. We should begin our search by looking not inside the individual and to individual genetic endowment, as we have assumed, but rather outside, in the environment, in the ways that individuals and contexts are co-constructed. The person and the environment must be understood together. For the self is permeable and relational, as well as self-promoting and self-furthering, rather than closed, discrete, and playing out its own internal program upon the world. And that was also anticipated by Spinoza, although I won't get into the text here. Neurological body maps, for example, extend the me to include the hammer I use when I nail the picture on the wall or the car when I'm driving. The neuroscientist of the emotions, Antonio Damasio, contends that we incorporate extended biographical and cultural aspects of the self within the neural self maps that give us our moment-by-moment feeling, tone of our body experience, and the feeling of our body as a whole. Environmental situations and self-responses are paired together, he says, and amassed and etched into our neural self maps as self over time. Meanings and feelings are brought together as well. In this way, we discover the world within ourselves as self and self-related, and we find ourselves being built up as world-related. At the same time, we also discover ourself beyond itself and located in the world, in the context, groups, projects, institutions we become part of and identify with. The psychologist Timothy Wilson points out that we are often strangers to ourselves, so introspection does not give us the kind of direct access to our true selves that we think it does. Descartes was wrong about this. Instead, we ought to look more often to context and environment to discover ourselves, our motives, and even our emotions. Neurophilosophers have begun to explore the phenomenon of distributed agency, which refers to a subject of action that is larger than the individual. The actor at times is actually the group. This is possible because our neurobiological feeling of self, what feels like me, has not turned out to be confined to within our skin. And in fact, we see this in out-of-body experiences. How radically our sense of self can overshoot the boundaries of the skin has been demonstrated by Olaf Blank and Thomas Metzinger's research on out-of-body experiences. Out-of-body illusions locate the feeling of self as coming from an illusory body outside of one's own actual body. The sense of where our body is and where its feelings come from can be projected onto parts of the environment and felt as coming from elsewhere. In trance and trance-like experiences and in Buddhist meditation, there is also a weakening of the self in body feeling, which becomes diffused into the environment or beyond the skin. Research into this Buddhist and trance experience of loss of self is now proving to be produced by a temporary attenuation of self maps. From this, we learn that the feeling of self is a mental capacity that can be projected inward, but also outward onto the world and onto others, onto groups. It is a feeling of ownership, of selfiness, and it is malleable and expandable. We make parts of the world feel like self, and we fill our feeling of self with our engagements, our projects and memberships and our identifications in the world. Our self is in fact in the world and not hidden within ourselves, as Descartes claimed. It is always and from the beginning made up of the relations of self and world. It is both historical and biographical, and it's a moving target. The chemistry of self beyond itself. Donald Pfaff of Rockefeller University shows that the feeling of self and where we draw the line between self and other, self and world, depends upon particular neurochemicals. These chemicals that produce the self-other divide, he says, are sometimes turned off. And when they are, we experience others as if they were ourselves. You see where our ethics is coming in? This neurochemistry that produces the feeling of self as distributed into others, he argues, underlies ethics. And it is these theories that Spinoza anticipated. And then we have mirror neurons. We have I'll go a little faster. We have mirror neurons. We have mirror neurons, V.S. Ramachandran says, will do for psychology what DNA did for biology. Mirror neurons are action, observation, execution, matching systems. Scientists invented the term mirror neurons to describe a set of brain cells that fire both when we are motivated to do an action and do it, and also when we see someone else doing that action but are not doing it ourselves. The mirror system enables not only joint action and agency, but also a form of immediate understanding of other people's actions, goals and emotions too. In understanding others' actions and emotions, we are producing the same state in our brain without the final execution of the action. Thus, we understand other people from the inside out, for we and they are internally and subjectively joined. Evolutionary cooperation and group selection. We are social primates. Human beings are groupy to an astounding degree. All right, complex adaptive systems. The mind leaks out into the world, and cognitive activity is distributed across individuals and situations. This is a brave new world. Why should anyone believe it? One part of the answer lies in the promise of dynamical systems theory. Insofar as the mind is a dynamical system, it is natural to think of it as extended not just into the body, but into the world. The result is a radical challenge to traditional ways of thinking of the mind. And I have published essays, articles on Spinoza's ethics as a systems theory. Another quote, when the individual makes a decision, that decision has usually been made within a wider framework of distributed cognition. And in many instances, it is fair to ask whether the decision was really made by the distributed cognitive cultural system itself, with the individual reduced to a subsidiary role. Distributed systems are able to change where in the system each component that influences a certain decision is located. Spinoza was right about the group mind. The insight that a person is an open system in relation to other open systems, natural and cultural, has begun to be rigorously articulated and theoretically worked out in the developing field of systems theory. Thinking about human behavior in terms of systems changes dramatically the way we conceive agency, what it means to act, who is doing the acting. It is the system that often makes the decision and acts. The control in a complex adaptive system is decentralized and widely distributed rather than being under some central control. In addition, diversity plays a crucial role in complex adaptive systems. The hallmark of complex adaptive systems is perpetual novelty. A complex adaptive system does not settle into locked-in patterns, but keeps producing change and, most important, self-correction. So here's my conclusion. Protecting diversity, especially by nurturing diverse groups with diverse opinions, is absolutely vital to the possibility of moral agency, for it makes available critical perspectives that foster whistleblowing, bystander intervention, and creative thinking and solutions. It is Spinoza's notion of universal perspective, subspecie eternitatis, the view from eternity, the divine view. It is from groups, often marginal ones, of which he was, of course, a part, with critical perspectives on those in power and less likely to succumb to knee-jerk loyalty to the presumed legitimacy of institutions and hierarchies and all kinds of groups, that critical perspectives, whistleblowing, bystander intervention, creative thinking, and even truth-telling can emerge. Such critical and broader perspectives, and the perspectives on oneself, critical perspectives on oneself, and larger perspectives as a result, and the actions that naturally follow from them, turn out to be not matters of will or even of individuals in isolation. Instead, they come on the scene more often than not from the periphery rather than the centers of power and normative beliefs and practices. Moreover, it is just such diversity that enables social systems to adapt to changing environments instead of stagnating. The isolation and insularity of groups of any scale form the great dangers to social justice, allowing and even instigating bad and evil actions while stifling dissent and broader and critical perspectives even before atrocities ensue. Marginal groups are often just as prone to the dangers of insularity, groupthink, as our normative ones. They too need to be challenged from inside and out. Moving on. The upshot is that sociality trumps individuality in human beings as a species, for good and for bad. Spinoza's ideal of cultivating independence of mind, freedom of thought, is a difficult and heady achievement, as difficult as it is rare, he opined. A transformation in motivation, in moral viewpoint toward a self that embraces and integrates broader and critical and self-critical points of view would be revolutionary. It leads to the rediscovery of oneself as at home in and at one with larger and larger social and natural worlds to infinity. That was Spinoza's great insight. It leads us toward an ecological and universal perspective, subspecies eternitatis, under a certain form of eternity. We cannot all get there through philosophy, through a Spinozist education of desire, but all of us can be set on a new path through changes in institutional structures that foster broader social diversity and the critical perspectives they offer on entrenched norms, legitimacies, and hierarchies. We can popularize ideas that support a new moral vision of freedom and joy for all individuals. Our default localism and provincialism can and ought to be socially, politically, and environmentally challenged and broadened and scientifically informed to bring out the best in us and also point the way to broader identifications with others and with the natural world, our very human survival, as well as our moral integrity, lie in the balance. Thank you.
take a few questions, but I want to ask the first one. If you,
Oh, I get to-
yeah, it's on. We can take a few questions, but I want to ask one. Do you mind? So thank you, Professor Ravven. But I have a question about maybe a practical question, but a big question.
Okay.
So I grew up in the 80s where the First Lady told us just say no. And today, though, we live in a society that I think has a different notion of addiction and drugs, and that's a good thing that sees it more in line of what you were talking about. But our justice system does not when it comes to other kinds of crimes, murder,
Yes.
Even white-collar crime. We think of Bertie Madoff or something like that. So
Right.
what would a just society, according to you, according to Spinoza, look like when it comes to a practical notion of a justice system?
That's correct. Yes, and in fact, Spinoza wants us to see bad actions almost like a tiger, right? It's natural to the tiger to kill, to kill you if it wants to. So what do? And he really wants us to move from a retributive form of justice to a restorative form of justice. And there are people in philosophy working on restorative justice systems. I believe there are some Scandinavian countries that have more of that kind of system. Of course, we in America have a very retributive system, and Spinoza would not support that, actually. And because he wants to see it in the larger context, and really to change the entire context. In other words, to change the person, you change the entire context.
Okay. So the research that was done post-Holocaust, where people ascribed an outsider's status as contributing to their decision-making, don't you think that was faulty science in that they were, by virtue of the decision they made, they became outsiders to the general culture, so that would have influenced their notion of who they were. But when they made that decision, they had multiple identities and things that were drawing on them. There was the society they lived in as Austrians. There was the Christian nature, or the Jewish nature, or whatever their religious belief was. They had a multiple set of beliefs that had impacted them, but they made a choice to go in the direction they made. So to me, I'm not sure that we can say that their choices were undermined or that they were enhanced because they were outsiders, as much as they were willing to put themselves into an outsider status. And I don't know that they would have had the reflection afterwards to be able to understand the difference.
I think there's a question of the salience of examples, right? So if we take, if we look at least some of the people who were saving, one of my salient examples with the people of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, who were Huguenot Protestants in a remote village in France. And they were outsiders. They also had wonderful leadership of Trocmé, Reverend Trocmé, who was a worldly person and a pacifist. And they, for example, rescued, they were 5,000, they rescued 5,000 Jews, and they said it was just natural to them, but they did not choose to be outsiders. They were outsiders, and they had a very critical view of the Vichy government and thought of Pétain as illegitimate. So that would be an example, a counterexample to your case. The question is perhaps to look at other cases, but in the cases that I have looked at, and the ones that I have seen, and of course there are many, many, many cases, my understanding is that many of those cases, these were people who were already outsiders and had critical views of the established authority that was Nazified.
Okay. Last question.
I wanted to follow up on the question the rabbi asked, actually. When you said the individual who is committing a crime, Spinoza kind of wants to us to look at him as like a tiger, and the tiger is going to kind of react, and he may not have agency. He's just going to do that. I guess my question is, when you say that we ought to, who's a we, somehow adjudicate diversity or adjudicate some of the things that you mentioned, are you saying that there's a disconnect where on the individual level, individuals may not have agency, but on some kind of group level, they do? And how would that connection happen?
Okay, no, I do. Spinoza's ethics is geared, the entire book is focused on enhancing people's agency, individuals' agency. When he turns to the Tractatus Theologico Politicus, he realized that groups have so much power, you better deal with the group as well. Because you're not going to get, there are people capable of real independence. Maybe those who go through a Spinozist education. But the problem is that you can't depend upon them in the larger socio-political context. In the socio-political context, you'd better manage the group. And diversity is one way to help manage that group, to encourage diversity, to encourage different forms of normativity, and also self-critical in terms of the larger perspective. For an individual education, individuals are, to some extent, capable of, through learning and self-reflection and self-understanding and broader understanding of the world, capable of enhanced agency in the sense of having more of the understanding of the world constituted inside them as self, right? So the more we understand the world, the more we identify with larger processes for Spinoza, the more we are capable of not only seeing, but of promoting that self which has now become the self, he hopes, of the universe, right? The self of the world. In other words, when you really begin to see how much you have been constituted by stardust, by everything that has ever gone on to make you you, and you act as this little piece of the universe, but the universe completely acting in you, then you begin to want, you begin to desire and have love, and that self is the larger self of community, of nature, of ecology. And in fact, the way that's been played out recently is in deep ecology, which is a movement that has looked at Spinoza as the source of its deep theoretical underpinnings for an ecological view of the world.
Hi.
Hi.
Two questions. First question would be, would you consider post-World War II Germany and what happened with that cultural rehabilitation, for lack of a better word, as successful? And if so, what is it that you would say made it successful? Or if not, what are the liabilities that continue?
I'm not a historian of post-war Germany, but I read the book. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the book. You know the book about the stumbling stones that I'm thinking of? Do you know, by the philosopher, an American philosopher who now lives in East Germany and has looked at the American South and Germany. You know what I'm talking about? And does anybody remember the name of, sorry, my age is showing. In any case, we can admire the extent to which the Germans have, to some extent, faced the Holocaust. They're doing, and certainly reparations. Do you know about the stumbling stones? Those are, each community puts, each community itself discovers voluntarily, they just do this as a project, who were the Jews who lived in certain places, and then they put stones in front of the houses of who was taken, who died, where they lived, where they died, and these stones are all over Germany. So there's an attempt now to do this in this author whose name is, I'm so sorry, she came to the United States, was at a civil rights institute in the South, and tried to institute this here. And actually, there is a group in the United States, in Connecticut and Massachusetts, and we tried to actually begin it in our area at Hamilton, to try to look to who were enslaved persons in our communities many years ago, and to, again, find their histories and acknowledge them and put, not stones in this case, but markers for them. And that project is going on too. My own feeling would, yes, I mean, I think that there's certainly more acknowledgement among the Germans to some extent than in many other instances. For example, there's no recognition in Japan of the atrocities against the Chinese in World War II, and we could give, infinite examples on that side, but certainly she argues that we should be doing more of these kind of projects here based on the German example. I'm sorry? No. I'm sorry. I can send it to you.
Well, friends, before we have some more Danash, let everybody stand up. Well, first, thank you to Professor Ravven. But we've been studying all Shabbat together, and let's end Shabbat with Havdalah. Come closer. I need some volunteers though to hold our accoutrement here.